For decades, the general consensus on the Sgt. Pepper's album, as the Beatles themselves said, is that it started out as a concept album, but ended up just being a collection of songs with no coherent narrative or meaning. In Anthology, Ringo said this: "The album was always going to have Sgt. Pepper at the beginning, and if you listen to the first 2 tracks, you can hear it was going to be a show album. It was Sgt. Pepper and his Lonely Hearts Club Band with all these other acts, and it was going to run like a rock opera." It had started out with a feeling that it was going to be something totally different, but we only got as far as Sgt. Pepper and Billy Shears, and then we thought, sod it, it's just 2 tracks. It still kept the title and the feel that it's all connected, although in the end we didn't actually connect all the songs up. John Lennon said this about the concept behind the album:
"It's called the first concept album. It doesn't go anywhere. Mr. Kite, all my contributions have absolutely nothing to do with this idea of Sgt. Pepper and his band. But it works because we said it worked, and that's how it appeared. It starts out with Sgt. Pepper and introduces Billy Shears, and that's the end apart from the so-called reprise. Otherwise, every other song could have been on any other album. Right. A Day in the Life could have gone anywhere. Mr. Kite could have gone anywhere."
But what if that wasn't entirely true? Of course, it might be true, but just come with me on this for a second. The last song on the album, A Day in the Life, was banned by the BBC for alleged drugs references and only unbanned some time after the band had actually split up. And that just gives you some idea of how easy it was to get banned back then by talking about drugs. Mainstream knowledge of drugs was only really beginning to emerge back then. It was nowhere near as well recognised and openly discussed as it is today. It was very taboo, and even people right in the Beatles' inner circle would deny at the time that there were drugs references there, only later to discover that there might actually have been more going on than they initially realised. Producer George Martin, for example.
"I was very cross that the BBC, in their infinite wisdom, decided to ban some of the tracks, and they wouldn't play it. They wouldn't play A Day in the Life. Why, I don't know. And they wouldn't play Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, because this rumour went round that it was all connected with drugs, and Lucy in the Sky actually stood for LSD, which wasn't true, and that it was an album which actually was promoting the use of drugs amongst the young."
George Martin, however, later clarified just how naive he was about all this stuff, saying that he didn't realise Lennon was actually tripping on acid while recording with him in the studio. Again, in Anthology 6, Martin said this:
"I was aware of them smoking pot. I wasn't aware that they did anything really serious. In fact, I was so innocent that I actually took John up onto the roof when he was having an LSD trip, not knowing what it was."
So, Sgt. Pepper's at least started out as a concept album. But what was the original concept even meant to be? After Revolver, the Beatles took some time off for a few months. George went to India, Ringo spent quality time with his family, John acted in a movie called How I Won the War. But Paul remained in London without his bandmates. The rest of the band, George and John in particular, had been pressuring Paul for months to try LSD. And initially he had resisted. However, once they were gone, curiosity got the better of him and he tried LSD for the first time. According to Beatles author Jonathan Gould, this initiation into LSD afforded McCartney the expansive new sense of possibility that defined the group's next project, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And Gould adds that McCartney's succumbing to peer pressure allowed Lennon to play the role of psychedelic guide to his songwriting partner, thereby facilitating a closer collaboration between the two than had been evident since early in the Beatles' career. So, between Revolver and the start of Sgt. Pepper's, Paul had his first LSD experience. And, after this, Paul came up with the idea of the Beatles becoming someone else for their next album.
I was coming back on a plane and I was with our roadie, Mal. He said, "Pass the salt and pepper." And I thought he said Sgt. Pepper. So that was the idea planted. What about that for an idea? You know, we'll pretend we're another band when we make this album. And the idea was when you walk up to the microphone, John, you won't be John Lennon. You'll be a guy out of this group so you can do anything you want.
However, I've always noticed how easy it is to find stories where the Beatles detail how the idea started or a little bit about how they got their costumes, but we never hear anything solid about the intended storyline that Paul pitched to the band. A change of image does not make a concept album on its own. New haircuts, psychedelic clothing and a funny name do not make a concept album, and neither does a new sound just on its own. I wonder what the actual story of Sgt. Pepper's was meant to be. Beatles studio engineer Geoff Emerick estimates that the Beatles spent approximately 700 hours making Sgt. Pepper's. That's 30 times longer than they spent on their debut. And the amount of money they spent as well was astronomical, the equivalent today of £500,000. It was a lavish, expensive, perfectionist project. Does everybody really believe that they spent that amount of time and money on their concept album masterpiece, only to end up abandoning the whole idea of a concept album itself early on, simply because they couldn't be asked? I don't know about you, but that's an idea that has never really sat 100% right with me. It just doesn't quite add up. What if the message and storyline of the Sgt. Pepper's album has been there all along, but the Beatles had to deny its existence to avoid getting cancelled 1960s style? What if the album has always been a concept album from start to finish, but with a controversial drugs-related message that had to be hidden? This is my original 1967 mono pressing of the album. It does look like a concept album, and it's structured like one. The album is split into 3 distinct acts, like a 3-act play. Act 1 is opened by the Sgt. Pepper's Band as compares, directly addressing the audience on track 1. Act 2 is opened by George, directly addressing the audience again at the opening of the B-side of the album. And Act 3 is opened yet again by the Sgt. Pepper's Band once more, directly addressing the audience and announcing the show is about to draw to a close. The concept of this being a kind of play, a show, does seem to run through the entire album, not just the first 2 tracks. And in other places, the Beatles seem to have made comments that confirm this. For example, George Harrison seemingly contradicted Ringo when asked about the meaning of the audience laughter at the end of the song Within You Without You, saying this: "It's a release after 5 minutes of sad music. You were supposed to hear the audience anyway as they listen to Sgt. Pepper's show. That was the style of the album." So we find that despite the most commonly reported comments from the Beatles that only the first 2 tracks were part of the concept album, elsewhere they confirm that there was actually more to the concept of the Sgt. Pepper's show than is commonly believed. Let's start to look a little bit closer, and you can see whether you think I'm on the right tracks or whether this is just an interesting way of reinterpreting the album. Just for fun, let's see if we can trace the threads of a storyline through this Beatles classic to make it work as a fully fledged concept album. There's a funny thing about concept albums. I've noticed that there are 2 distinct types. There's an open concept album, The Wall by Pink Floyd being a great example, in which the story of the character Pink is told in song. The existence of the storyline in the album is openly discussed by the band. It's not a secret. They don't deny it, everything is out in the open and above board. But then there is also a second type of concept album, and I believe it's the most common: a closed concept album. In a closed concept album there is a very noticeable theme to the whole thing in the artwork, the lyrics and the music. The order of the songs seems to be telling some kind of story you can't quite put your finger on immediately. And more often than not, the musician or artist who created the concept album denies that it actually is one. Ziggy Stardust is a great example of this slightly confusing phenomenon. In these closed concept albums, the artists rarely admit the storyline behind them, preferring the listener to reach their own conclusions. And often there are 2 levels of meaning. Each song has its own meaning and context when taken on its own. But there is also a secondary meaning that only becomes apparent when you take the album as a whole. A larger meaning that becomes clear by connecting the dots of the album tracks listened to in order, a meaning hidden in the sequencing of the songs. A great example of this is the song Wake Me Up When September Ends from the American Idiot album by Green Day. That song was written about the passing of the singer's father, but in the context of the album it functions instead as a jigsaw piece in that larger overarching storyline. One song, two meanings. My own debut album, which comes out at the end of this month, is also a concept album, somewhere in the middle of these two types. And if you're interested in trying to figure it out, go get a copy on vinyl and let me know if you piece the overarching storyline together. The link is in the description below. But now let's look at the Beatles. From comments made by John Lennon, we know that a number of the songs on this album were written with no real relation to each other. So it can't be an open concept album. But is it a closed one? Were the individual songs with their separate meanings chosen and sequenced to tell a secret story hidden just below the surface? A story that only makes sense when you listen to the album from start to finish. A secret rock opera. Now it's clear from multiple interviews with George, John and Ringo that they did not view Sgt. Pepper's as a finished concept album. But what about Paul? Beatles author Walter Everett says, Sgt. Pepper marks the beginning of McCartney's ascendancy as the Beatles' dominant creative force. He wrote more than half the album's material while asserting increasing control over the recording of his compositions. Paul was largely directing the whole project and was at this point emerging as the leader of the band. But the other Beatles did resent this a little, and it was increasingly becoming a kind of 1 versus 3 scenario, with Paul a little bit out there on his own. But it was Paul who came up with the whole Pepper idea in the first place. The whole concept really was his baby. And in the years shortly after the Beatles split, I always found it absolutely fascinating the degree to which the other 3 members of the band read hidden meanings into Paul's songs and lyrics that I never would have noticed in a million years. For example, when Paul released his solo album Ram, it was interpreted by John, his close songwriting partner, as being packed with hidden secret jibes at him, Yoko and others. In an interview with Crawdaddy magazine, Lennon said this, I heard Paul's messages in Ram. Yes, there are, dear reader. Too many people going where? Missed our lucky what? What was our first mistake? Can't be wrong. I mean, Yoko, me and other friends can't all be hearing things. According to the brilliant Beatles Bible website, Lennon believed there were several coded messages in the lyrics of Ram, notably in the songs Too Many People, Dear Boy, 3 Legs and The Backseat of My Car. The album art of Ram also showed 2 actual insect beetles having sex, which was also interpreted as Paul sending out a message that he was a beetle getting fucked by another beetle. So Lennon believed that at least 4 of the songs on Ram were aimed at him. Yoko agreed, and so did many of their friends. And who else could have known more about Paul's songwriting style than John Lennon? I'll be honest, I read the lyrics to these songs and never would have picked that out or reached that conclusion. But according to Lennon, those messages were there nonetheless. George and Ringo also felt targeted by McCartney's lyrics, specifically in the song 3 Legs, also on Ram. So there we can see the people from Paul's inner circle, the people who knew him best, who knew his songwriting style best, saw loads of hidden meanings in his songs, almost to the point of paranoia. So, what does that tell us about their understanding of Paul's songwriting style? It tells us that his songs were probably often packed with secret double meanings. Why else would every other member of the Beatles react in that way to such seemingly innocuous lyrics? And of course, despite denying the hidden meanings at the time, Paul has since admitted to some of these secret messages in later years. So, at the time of Pepper, Paul was becoming a little bit isolated from the others. He was in the habit, according to John Lennon, of including coded messages in his songs. Sgt. Pepper's was Paul's idea and Paul's baby. So, is it a realistic idea that secret messages were included in this? I think it is a realistic possibility that while Pepper is not an open concept album, it could be a closed one, with the songs arranged, compiled and sequenced by Paul intentionally to tell a story, but one that they couldn't openly come out and claim because it would have been so controversial. Ringo was a bit ambivalent about the whole thing.
It's a fine album. It's a fine album, but I did learn to play chess on it because I'd have so much spare time.
John also was a bit lukewarm.
Wasn't that spectacular? I mean, when you look back on it, I mean, like anything, it was great then. But people just have this dream about Pepper, and it was good for then, you know.
George was pretty openly negative.
For me, it was kind of a bit tiring, or it was a bit boring because, I mean, I had a few moments in there that I enjoyed, but generally, I didn't really like that album much. My heart was still in India, you know. After that, everything else seemed like hard work, you know. It was a job. It was like doing something I didn't really want to do. I was losing interest in being fab at that point.
But then, look what Paul says.
I thought it was great. I thought it was a huge advance. When it came out, I was loved it. I kind of had a party, you know, sort of celebrate. That weekend was a bit of a party, as I recall.
So now, let's look at the lyrics and the album as a whole, moving forward with the idea and at least the possibility that Paul wrote his songs and incorporated the other Beatles songs into the track sequencing to create a secret concept album that really actually does tell a story from start to finish. The album opens with track 1, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And this song begins with the sound of the orchestra tuning up and the audience taking their seats. I wonder specifically where this show is taking place. More on that later. All of a sudden, the show starts, and no surprises, Paul is introducing the concept to the listener. Paul is the host and compere. He opens the show by introducing the band under a different name. Please say hello to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And then, after being introduced, the curtain goes up and the band come on stage, playing brass instruments, clowning around, making the audience laugh and applaud. And this opening song breaks the fourth wall, addressing the audience directly and letting them know that the play is about to begin. And the album does this same thing in several places, usually heralding the end or the start of an act. I don't really want to stop the show, but I thought you might like to know that the singer's going to sing a song and he wants you all to sing along. So let me introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And of course we can assume that Billy is an important character because he's introduced first. Billy is about to take to the stage and the story is going to begin in earnest. Let's move on now to track 2. A little help from my friends. Running seamlessly from track 1 to track 2 without a break, the band introduce Billy, and then the song opens with Billy addressing the audience and warning them that some of what is to come might not be what they are expecting. He sings, "What would you think if I sang out of tune? Would you stand up and walk out on me? Lend me your ears and I'll sing you a song and I'll try not to sing out of key." It's just a gentle warning, isn't it? The first thing he tells the audience is they may hear some stuff that doesn't sound quite right to their ears. But he hopes that if he sings something that they don't like the sound of, that they will still listen to what he has to say and not stand up and leave the play. The original line apparently said, "Would you throw ripe tomatoes at me?" But this was changed at Ringo's request out of fear that fans seeing him in the street would throw tomatoes at him. In verse 2, at last the story is underway and we find out a little bit about Billy as he is asked questions by the house band and responds. "What do I do when my love is away? Does it worry you to be alone? How do I feel by the end of the day? Are you sad because you're on your own? So, here's our first bit of character information about Billy. He has a girlfriend, a love, but they are not together all the time as they wish to be. We can assume they don't live together, which would be typical of the times. Back then it really was frowned upon to live together out of wedlock. But when asked if he is sad and worried, he replies, "No, I get by with a little help from my friends. I get high with a little help from my friends. Gonna try with a little help from my friends." So his friends help him through his loneliness. They help him get by, but he also does drugs with them. And then in verse 3 we find out another really interesting fact about Billy. He believes in love at first sight. And once again we might find out a little bit more about his experience of falling in love at first sight later on in the album. And then there's that fascinating line that says, "What do you see when you turn out the light? I can't tell you, but I know it's mine." Now, famously, the Beatles made a few cracks about this line, saying it meant having a wank in bed at night. But honestly, I think they just made that crack to throw dust in the air a little bit. It's very similar to Noel Gallagher in the 90s being asked what the song Morning Glory was about and replying, "Waking up with a stiffy." Pretty funny, but clearly a joke. Billy has some kind of secret that he can't share openly with the audience. When taken alongside the warning that he might seem out of tune to his listeners, it makes an interesting message, doesn't it? Right from the word go, we get this sense of warning. There's something secret here, there's something unusual here, there's something concealed. After this song was released in America, Governor and future Vice President Agnew actually lobbied to have this song banned because he believed it was about drug use. So as we go through selections of the lyrics in this album song by song, each time we're going to ask the same question. Is there anything that links one track to the next? Is there any obvious connection? The connection between track 1 and track 2 could not have been more obvious. They literally run into one another, both musically and lyrically. But what about tracks 2 and 3? A Little Help from My Friends and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Well, song 2 finishes with Billy getting high with his friends, and then of course we go straight into a song written about LSD, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Yes, there is a direct connection. So let's look at track 3. Is it really about LSD? I think the evidence that it is pretty compelling. It was written at a time when all 4 Beatles were actively using LSD. It describes the strange psychedelic visions which you might see on an LSD trip. It's called Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which could be seen to stand for LSD. The song has in fact become so synonymous today with acid that people often just refer to the drug as Lucy. Of course, Lennon and the other Beatles claimed repeatedly that it was about a painting that Julian Lennon drew. But it's clearly, at the very least, mostly about LSD. And of course, despite the Beatles' denials for many years, just as he did with the hidden messages on Ram, later on, Paul did admit what everyone could already see, that Lucy was actually about acid. The song opens with these lyrics. Picture yourself in a boat on a river, with tangerine trees and marmalade skies. Somebody calls you, you answer quite slowly, a girl with kaleidoscope eyes. So the lights go down on the stage, leaving Billy getting high with his friends. As the lights come up for the next song, however, all the world is changed, because Billy has taken LSD for the first time, just as Paul did right before making this album. And in this hallucinatory state, Billy meets a woman, but we don't know who she is because she's disguised. She's wearing a mask with kaleidoscope eyes. Picture yourself in a boat on a river. This line is directly linked to the beginning of an acid trip. This is the partner line to turn off your mind, relax and float downstream from Tomorrow Never Knows. John Lennon was greatly influenced at this time by a book called The Psychedelic Experience by Timothy Leary, which taught that enlightenment can be achieved through LSD trips. And this gently drifting down the river part is the very beginning just as the drug is starting to take hold. Cellophane flowers of yellow and green towering over your head. Look for the girl with the sun in her eyes and she's gone. So Billy is now surrounded on stage by towering flowers, and if they were stage props, they would be made of something like cellophane, wouldn't they? The girl with the reflective psychedelic mask on leaves the stage and Billy follows her. Follow her down to a bridge by a fountain where rocking horse people eat marshmallow pies. Everyone smiles as you drift past the flowers that grow so incredibly high. So let's say Billy has just taken LSD, but he's still doing things in the real world. They're just kind of warped and distorted by the drug. He has followed the mystery masked girl into town and they've reached a bridge by a fountain. But who is this mystery girl? Everyone Billy sees, including the girl, is distorted and changed by the LSD, wearing outlandish costumes and acting weirdly. Newspaper taxis appear on the shore, waiting to take you away. Climb in the back with your head in the clouds and you're gone. Billy has followed the girl. They get into a taxi made of paper mache, as a prop might be. Billy climbs in the back, stoned out of his mind, and the newspaper taxi drives away. Picture yourself on a train in a station, with plasticine porters with looking glass ties. Suddenly someone is there at the turnstile, the girl with kaleidoscope eyes. And so now we find out where they were going in the taxi, to the train station. The porters are all distorted and psychedelic, changed by the acid trip. And there, by the turnstile, entering the station with Billy, is the mystery girl. And this, of course, poses questions just as a storyteller might. Who is she? Where are the two of them getting a train to? And why? Answers will be provided soon. So now let's move on to track 4 and let's ask the all-important question. Is there anything that links track 3, Lucy in the Sky, to track 4, Getting Better? Getting Better tells a story of how I used to be versus I am now a changed man. Coming right after Lucy in the Sky, it could be taken to mean that Billy, the star of the Pepper Show, has been transformed by his experience. And on this note, it's really interesting to hear what the Beatles themselves said about how their first LSD trip changed them.
I suppose the first feeling I really had that was strong, spiritual feeling, was after taking LSD. Somebody, John Lennon and I were having dinner with somebody who was a dentist, and he dropped LSD in our coffee, and we took it, and ever since then it's all changed. I don't know, I just took one look at the trees and the grass and the sky, and I thought, yeah, that's it.
John Lennon said, LSD was the self-knowledge which pointed the way. Paul McCartney as well said, LSD opened my eyes to the fact that there is a God. It explained the mystery of life. It was truly a religious experience. It started to find its way into everything we did. And perhaps this is the experience of Billy as well in this storyline. Right after Lucy in the Sky, we get the story of someone whose life has changed, who used to be angry, who used to be violent, but is now changing their ways. And in the first verse, here we see a clear distinction being drawn between the old institutionalized, structured world and the new free love and drugs world of the 60s that was just then emerging. You're holding me down, turning me round and filling me up with your rules.
They've got all these rules for everything, rules of how to live, how to paint, how to make music. And it's just not true anymore, you know. They don't work, all those rules. There could be another answer, you know.
The chorus says, I have to admit it's getting better since you've been mine. And I don't think this is Billy singing directly to his girl. I think this is addressed to Lucy, the drug. In exactly the same way that Got to Get You Into My Life on the previous album was effectively a love song addressed to marijuana. I used to be cruel to my woman. I beat her and kept her apart from the things that she loved. Man, I was mean, but I'm changing my scene and I'm doing the best that I can. So again, we've got that duality. We've got Billy before LSD and Billy after. He used to be full of hurt, pain and anger, but now through his experiences in this make-believe story, he's leaving that behind him, just as Lennon did, and becoming a new, much more peaceful person.
All that, I used to be cruel to my woman and beat her. That's me, because I used to be cruel to my woman and physically. Any woman. You know, I was a hitter. I couldn't express myself, and I fought men, I hit women, I was violent. That's why I'm always on about peace. You see, it's the most violent people that go for love and peace. And I sincerely believe in love and peace. But I am absolutely a violent man who has learned not to be violent.
Earlier we looked at George Martin not realising that John Lennon was actually tripping on acid one time in the studio. Interestingly, this is the song they were recording. And that night recording Getting Better in the studio marked the first time that John and Paul actually took LSD together, during which they also had a fairly strange bonding experience back at Paul's house in London. Picking up the story after John Lennon realised he'd taken acid, Rolling Stone says, safely back in the studio, Lennon realised he was in no state to record. But there was a problem. Lennon's driver wasn't due to return to Abbey Road for several hours, and his wife Cynthia was fast asleep. To keep watch over his vulnerable friend, McCartney decided to take him back to his own home on Cavendish Avenue, a short walk from the studio. As he and Lennon made the quick trip to his Regency townhouse in the early hours of March the 22nd, McCartney made a snap decision. I thought, maybe this is the moment where I should take a trip with him, he recalled. It's been coming for a long time. It's often the best way, without thinking about it too much, just slip into it. John's on it already, so I'll sort of catch up. It was my first trip with John or any of the guys. We stayed up all night, sat around and hallucinated a lot. Me and John, we'd known each other for a long time. Along with George and Ringo, we were best mates. And we looked into each other's eyes, the eye contact thing we used to do, which is fairly mind-boggling. You dissolve into each other, and it was amazing. You're looking into each other's eyes, and you would want to look away but you wouldn't, and you could see yourself in the other person. It was a very freaky experience, and I was totally blown away. John had been sitting around very enigmatically, and I had a big vision of him as king, the absolute emperor of eternity. It was a good trip. So both Lennon and McCartney were at this time embracing and enjoying the effects of LSD. And so we have to say that Getting Better, coming right after Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, once again does kind of make sense in the idea of a concept album. So far, we do seem to have what could be an unbroken story that holds together. Now let's move on to track 5. Fixing a Hole. Of the writing of this song, Paul said this: "It's pretty much my song. Around that time, if I closed my eyes, instead of there being blackness, there was a little blue hole. It was as if something needed patching. I always had the feeling that if I could go up to it and look through, there would be an answer." The fact is that the most important influence here was not even the metaphysical idea of a hole, but this absolutely physical phenomenon, something that first appeared after I took acid. I still see it occasionally, and I know exactly what it is. And so, there you have it. Paul confirms that the hole that needed fixing was directly connected to LSD. Are we starting to pick up the obvious theme yet? But let's get back to the play. Let's now look at the lyrics and see what they might be saying in the ongoing saga of Billy Shears. "I'm fixing a hole where the rain gets in and stops my mind from wandering. I'm filling the cracks that ran through the door and kept my mind from wandering. I'm painting the room in a colourful way, and when my mind is wandering, there I will go." In song 4, Billy realised that his trip had changed him for the better. Now he seems to be more fully committing to this new psychedelic world. He wants more of this new life he's discovered, and he also wants to start shutting out the old world with its institutions and structures. In this song, the singer wants to be in a colourful room where he allows his mind to wander. What do you think that means? So again, we have that two-sided world like we had in Getting Better. Inside, in the colourful world, is where he wants to be, and he wants to block out the outside world, which is grey and raining. He's going into this new world, closing the door and sealing up all the cracks so nobody can disturb him once he's inside. In so many ways, this story so far completely epitomises the experience of so many young people in the 1960s. Let's move on to track 6, She's Leaving Home. If you remember, we were left with a few questions hanging in the air earlier on in Act 1. One of those questions was, who was the disguised mystery girl that Billy went to the train station with while tripping, the one wearing a mask with kaleidoscope eyes? The next track, She's Leaving Home, tells a story that could be seen to be answering the question that's been hanging in the air throughout Act 1. She's Leaving Home is a complete scene change. Billy's story is paused for a moment, and then all of a sudden we pick up a new thread, and this time it's the story of a girl. Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock as the day begins, silently closing her bedroom door, leaving the note that she hoped would say more, she goes down the stairs to the kitchen, clutching her handkerchief, quietly turning the back door key, stepping outside she is free. Now, do you remember what one of the very first things we learned about Billy was? He has a girl, but they're kind of separated. She's often away. I wonder if this is the girl, and here we are learning the reason that they were so often separated, the reason she was so often away. She lived with her parents. Back then, by the old school rules of British society, she wouldn't have been able to move in with Billy. Next we hear the lament of the parents who feel betrayed and abandoned by their daughter who is not following in the life that they had hoped she would. And the next verse repeats exactly the same sentiment. And again, that really is an exact reflection of the realities of society at this time. The previous generation didn't understand what the youth of the 60s wanted, what they believed, or how they chose to live. Just as we did in tracks 4 and 5, here in track 6 we are once again seeing that two-sided battle. The old formal world of English culture versus the new youth movement. The theme really is surprisingly consistent from song to song. And then in the next verse we jump forward a little bit in the story. The girl left home on Wednesday and now 2 days have passed. It's Friday morning and she has travelled to meet someone. A man. He must be someone very important to her if he was special enough to leave home for. Quite possibly her lover then. Friday morning at 9 o'clock she is far away, waiting to keep the appointment she made, meeting a man from the motor trade. The first part of this album seemed to tell the story of Billy going away with a girl. What if this is the same story but this time told from her perspective? What if this song is bringing the first act towards its conclusion by answering a whole host of questions that were raised at the beginning? Who is Billy's love, the one who is often away? Who is the woman he used to be cruel to? Who did he meet while tripping on acid and followed to the train station? I wonder if we might have our answer. But let's be honest, are these connections I'm drawing just all coincidence? Or are they all part of the same play, connecting up and telling the same tale? If, like me, you think there's a possibility that it's not coincidence, then we have potentially also found out something more about Billy. He has a job in the motor trade. He works with cars. And this will come up again later, several times. The girl's parents continue their lament and the pepper band answer their questions. What did we do that was wrong? We didn't know it was wrong. And the band reply, she is having fun. Fun is the one thing that money can't buy. Something inside that was always denied for so many years. She's leaving home. Bearing in mind the fairly obvious theme of the album so far, LSD, what do you think having fun means? And a few songs earlier we had Billy tripping balls on LSD, running away with a girl. It really could be two sides of the same coin, two parts of the same story. But what about the connections from track 6 to track 7? Is there any obvious link between this song and the one that comes next? Well, I imagine two people running away together on LSD could very easily be compared to running away with the circus. And of course, that's exactly what we get next. Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite was a song written mostly by John and in the show it effectively represents the big spectacular to end the first act. It's a kind of concluding moment, a big display of pyrotechnics to finish the first act with a bang. Billy and his love look on in wonder at the new world of drug-fueled marvels they have now entered together. Mr. Kite, suitably named as they are both high as kites, is the ringmaster over this spectacle, and then the curtain drops, signifying the end of Side A and Act 1. And Act 1 has done the job it was meant to do. Our main characters have gone on a journey. They've fully left behind the starchy old grey institutionalised English world, and they've embraced the new psychedelic 60s culture. We now move on to Side 2 and Act 2, and this phase of the album opens with George Harrison's only song on Pepper, Within You, Without You. And, of course, it picks up again thematically exactly where we left off. The idea of the world being split into two types of people, the old way versus the new. And we're brought back in by a kind of meditation through Indian music, which would have been very exotic, novel and interesting to many listeners who would never have heard that style of music before back then. And so, just as Act 1 finished with a spectacle, Act 2 opens with one as well. We were talking about the space between us all, and the people who hide themselves behind a wall of illusion, never glimpse the truth, then it's far too late when they pass away. There are many similarities between this track, which is the opening song on Side 2, and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which is the opening track on Side 1. They both break the fourth wall, directly addressing the audience. They both break the wall of illusion, if you like. And here he also introduces the unique theme of Side 2 of the album. Join us now, because it's too late when you're dead. George goes on, we were talking about the love we all could share, when we find it, to try our best to hold it there. With our love, we could save the world, if they only knew. He seems to want the whole world on board. He seems to want a massive revolution. We get the idea of this new drugs and love lifestyle completely eclipsing the old. It really is quite an evangelistic song, inviting people to join the cult, so to speak.
There's no desire in any of our heads to sort of take over the world, you know. That was Hitler, that's what he wanted to do. There is, however, a desire to get power in order to use it for good. If you've got power, you've got to use it for the good.
We were talking about the love that's gone so cold, and the people who gain the world and lose their soul. They don't know, they can't see. Are you one of them? In perhaps one of the most aggressive moments on the record, George directly asks the listener, are you one of them? That us and them message is never made more starkly than this. Are you one of the bad guys? Are you part of the establishment? Are you supporting the old institutions? Are you one of the enemy without realising it? And just as we have laughter from the audience in the first track on Side 1, so too in Within You Without You, at the beginning of Side 2, we hear the audience laughing once again, right at the end of the track. Of course, we have that quote we looked at earlier where George quite literally confirms that he wanted laughter on there because it was all part of the Sgt. Pepper's concept. And so, once again, we've had the introduction from the hosts, and in the next track, we pick up the story exactly where it left off. Track 9 is When I'm 64, and in isolation, this song sounds bizarre, twee, and like an out-of-date load of music hall cheese. In the concept of this Sgt. Pepper's show, however, it fits in perfectly. You remember how in the very first song on the album, Paul said the band have been going in and out of style for 20 years. I think the throwback style of this song lines up with that. This is one of their older, out-of-style songs. And let's look at where we left the story of Billy and his girl. They ran away together and effectively joined a circus. And now, on the second track of Side 2, where we would expect the story to resume, we find a man asking a woman if they are going to be together forever. But there does seem to be a bit more to it than that. There seems to be a tension hanging in the air on this track. The person singing seems to be waiting for an answer from the girl about an important question, but it's not just, will you still like me when we're both old? There seems to be a more specific answer that he wants. Send me a postcard, drop me a line stating point of view. Indicate precisely what you mean to say. Yours sincerely, wasting away. Give me your answer, fill in a form, mine forevermore. Will you still need me? Will you still feed me when I'm 64? The singer, who might be Billy, is desperately waiting for some kind of answer. When does anyone fill in a form that makes you someone else's forevermore? It's a marriage certificate. The singer is asking his girl to marry him, and she hasn't answered yet. And one brilliant little Easter egg in this song, Paul is singing, and his voice has been audibly raised to be a little higher in pitch than it really is. And so there's this almost helium effect on his singing all the way through the song. His voice is a little higher than normal, so you might go so far as to say he's high when he's making his proposal. So When I'm 64 ends with that question hanging in the air, will you marry me? And the next song, Lovely Rita, opens with a kind of celebration and a release of all that tension. Assuming this is a storyline, we can take it that Billy's girl has said yes, because in the track after, we get reference to his wife. And also because the opening lines to this song, track 10, Lovely Rita, say, Lovely Rita, meet a maid, nothing can come between us. When it gets dark, I tow your heart away. Nothing can come between us. They are now inseparable. This could be an engagement party. And at this point, the last thing that was completely hidden at the start of the story and has been revealed progressively in stages is at last fully unveiled. Have we just found out the name and identity of Billy's mystery girlfriend? We could interpret it that way. Standing by a parking meter when I caught a glimpse of Rita, filling in the ticket in her little white book. In a cap she looked much older, and the bag across her shoulder made her look a little like a military man. So, could this be Billy telling in retrospect the story of the first time he clapped eyes on Rita, his love? This could be the final gap in their backstory. And there's all kinds of interesting threads that we can pick up at this point. Because, if you remember, Billy is a man from the motor trade, as mentioned in one of Paul's earlier songs. And now, in another Paul song, here is a car enthusiast falling in love with his opposite, a traffic warden. And do you remember in song 2, Billy told us that he believes in love at first sight. Here we have a story of someone literally falling in love at first sight. Opposites attract. The man from the motor trade fell in love at first sight with the traffic warden. I took her out and tried to win her, had a laugh, and over dinner told her I would really like to see her again. Got the bill and Rita paid it, took her home and nearly made it, sitting on the sofa with a sister or two. So here we have the story of their first date. They had a laugh over dinner, and as if to make up for the parking ticket she gave him, Rita pays for their meal. Again, breaking with convention, the old English way was the man would always pay. So, even in this song we do have a hint of that duality, the breaking with the old and embracing the new. The song also has a really weird outro with John Lennon making strange noises, and then it closes with him saying, "They'll never believe it."
Never believe it.
Believe what, I wonder? This artifact, this little soundbite, wasn't left in by accident. But now we come on to track 11, Good Morning, Good Morning. Now, on song 11, we have a married couple. We have the first reference to him and his wife. But there is now definitely much more a sense of apathy and disappointment about the whole thing. Nothing to do to save his life, call his wife in. Nothing to say but what a day, how's your boy been? Nothing to do, it's up to you. I've got nothing to say, but it's okay. We've come to the last part of Act 2, the last plot instalment before the band come back out to break the fourth wall and address the audience again. And here we can see we've jumped forwards quite a way. They're married and there seems to be a son in the picture as well. However, the singer sounds bored, tired and uninspired. He's got nothing to do and nothing to say. In the context of the storyline, it's almost as if we've come full circle. Billy was a bit despondent and directionless at the start of the story, and here, towards the end, we find him in exactly the same place again. He has somehow ended up back in the ordinary institutionalised world he had once tried to escape. He has a wife, a child and a job, and he's depressed. This song was written by John, who was married and had a young son at that time. It's really interesting to hear how the things reported in this song actually mirror John's life.
The problem was with that period was that because I was living a more suburban life with a wife and kid, he was sort of tripping around town and that and hanging out, being a bachelor. He would work something out, even on Sergeant Pepper, which was his original idea, and do a lot of work on it, and then suddenly call me and say, well, it's time to go in the studio, write some songs. Whereas he'd have all prepared and ready with ideas and arrangements, and I would be starting from scratch. And that's why I got resentful later on. I sort of succumbed to marriage and eating.
The lyrics continue. Going to work, don't want to go, feeling low down. Heading for home, you start to roam, then you're in town. Everybody knows there's nothing doing. Everything is closed, it's like a ruin. Everyone you see is half asleep. And you're on your own, you're in the street. Again, we've come full circle. The band asked Billy right at the beginning, are you sad because you're on your own? And here at the end of the story is Billy, if we choose to call him that, on his own and really kind of depressed and despondent again. He finishes his workday, but for some reason, as if searching for something, he decides that instead of going home, he's going to just roam around the town. It starts to dawn on him that he has become part of the grey world. Everything is closed. It's like wandering around a ruin. All the people are like dazed zombies. There's no life or colour anywhere. But then, in the next verse, all of a sudden, things change. After a while, you start to smile. Now you feel cool. Then you decide to take a walk by the old school. Nothing is changed. It's still the same. I've got nothing to say, but it's okay. Billy has been wandering through town, depressed and alone, and then suddenly everything changes. I reckon the implication here is that he's met a dealer and got some gear. I wonder if, stoned, he wanders through town to the place where the teachers who taught him weren't cool. The world is still drab and grey, but he realises that the way of escape is exactly the same. He's taken LSD again and seen the world come to life again. People running round, it's 5 o'clock. Everywhere in town is getting dark. Everyone you see is full of life. It's time for tea and meet the wife. All those people in town who moments before seemed half asleep are now suddenly full of life. He decides to head home for his tea now that he feels better. But before he gets home, a pretty girl asks him the time, and he begins to flirt with her. He asks her out to a show, and the story begins again. He is back on drugs and has found a new love. And so, there you see, the story seems to end in exactly the same place it started. At the beginning, Billy is lonely and just getting by. He finds his escape through drugs and running away with Rita. And here, it ends in the same way, with the start of a new story, exactly the same. It's a circular story told on a circular format. A circular story in more ways than one.
He just calls up and he says, I've got this idea, but I was in more on the scratch of that. He had this circle idea that he'd fill in with what segment was what.
And interestingly, writing circular stories seems to be something that Paul really was into at this time, because he used the same strategy on the Magical Mystery Tour. But now let's ask the question, does this track connect to the next one? And of course it does. As if confirming once again that all these songs are connected, this song runs straight into the next one with a kind of chicken squawking noise merging into a guitar feedback noise seamlessly, and the next track begins. And so the second act is ended and the third act announced in the same way as 1 and 2 were. The Pepper Band come back on stage, the fourth wall is broken and the music is addressed directly to the audience. We're Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. We hope you have enjoyed the show. We're sorry, but it's time to go. We'd like to thank you once again. It's getting very near the end. In a sense, the song literally serves no other purpose than to be a bookend to Act 2 and to announce the climactic end of the show in Act 3. And once again, just as we did in tracks 1 and 8, we have the audience whooping and cheering as the song approaches the climactic finish, A Day in the Life. And so, as the last track begins, John walks out into centre stage alone with an acoustic guitar, a single blue spotlight on him, and he starts to sing. I read the news today, oh boy, about a lucky man who made the grade. And though the news was rather sad, well, I just had to laugh. I saw the photograph. He blew his mind out in a car. He didn't notice that the lights had changed. A crowd of people stood and stared. They'd seen his face before. Nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lords. So, how does this fit into the idea that the whole album is about a new way of thinking, about LSD? The lucky man was Tara Brown, the heir to the Guinness Empire. But guess what? He wasn't just some random famous person. As if confirming the whole idea that this album is entirely about the effects of Billy taking LSD for the first time, Tara, the man who died in the car accident, was the person who induced Paul's first ever LSD trip in 1966 at Brown's home in London. This was during the 3-month gap after Revolver, when the Peppers concept was conceived. On the 17th of December 1966, Brown was driving with his girlfriend through South Kensington at high speeds. He was under the influence of alcohol and other drugs at the time. Brown failed to see a traffic light and proceeded through the junction, colliding with a parked lorry. He died of his injuries the following day. And as if tying into this idea, if you listen deep down in the mix of the link from the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band reprise into A Day in the Life, buried down in there, there is audio of John saying, "Oh my God, it kills me," with George behind him saying, "Bang, bang, 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 bang."
Oh my God, it kills me.
Immediately after which, we go straight into the story of the death of the man who introduced Paul to LSD. Surely those comments were not left in the mix by accident either. Those words, those artifacts are there intentionally. So an album conceived and led by Paul, telling the story of the effects of a man's first LSD trip, turns out to directly reference the man who took Paul on his first LSD trip. You might disagree, but for me, the coincidences are starting to mount a bit too high now. And do you remember that we said Billy was a man from the motor trade who fell in love with a traffic warden? Remember, this is a closed concept album, so while songs can mean one thing when you take them in isolation, they mean something different within the flow of the album. They're part of a different, larger story. In the context of the imaginary show, this could be telling us that Billy went on to be a lucky man. He made the grade, he may even have been a member of the House of Lords. And, as is fitting for the man who worked with cars and married a traffic warden, he died, stoned off his face, in a car. Let's take a quick look at Paul's section of this song, which is the middle section that's kind of been just shoehorned in between John's verses. Woke up, fell out of bed, dragged a comb across my head, found my way downstairs and drank a cup, and looking up I noticed I was late, found my coat and grabbed my hat, made the bus in seconds flat, found my way upstairs and had a smoke, and somebody spoke and I went into a dream. Just as it was in real life, for a while Paul wasn't on the bus, but now he was.
Woke up, fell out of bed, dragged a comb across my head. That was a little bit I had. It wasn't doing anything. And so we thought, well, that'd be good. We could put that in the middle. And we got the concept of sort of building it a little bit like a sort of mini operetta.
Do you see how Paul is still thinking in terms of a concept and a rock opera? His middle section kind of summarises the whole album in one short verse. He was in the ordinary world combing his hair and having a cup of tea, and then he went upstairs on the double-decker bus, smoked something and went into the dream world. Being on the bus was synonymous at this time with being part of the new drugs and free love hippie movement. Now, loads of people who are into the Paul is dead conspiracy believe that Billy Shears is Paul. Personally, I don't. So who is Paul in the play? Well, let's take a look at the fully intact, original 1967 cutouts that came with the album. The cutouts include this fella. It's a picture of Sergeant Pepper himself. What colour is he wearing? Blue. What colour is Paul wearing? Blue. Who was the band leader, the man in charge of this whole project? Paul. Who acts as compere and host and introduces the band in the very first song? Paul. It's interesting as well that in this period the Beatles all had these kind of walrus moustaches, and it even comes with a cutout walrus moustache for the listener to wear. So here's another clue for you all. The walrus is Paul. Paul isn't Billy, Paul is the band leader. Paul is Sergeant Pepper. And while we're talking about the Paul is dead conspiracy, did you know Paul literally chose the name Billy Shears for the main character of the play because the man who was rumoured to have replaced him was supposed to be called William Campbell Shears. And just to make this thing into yet another circular story, William Shears was supposed to have replaced Paul after he allegedly died in a car crash. But the most interesting bit to me is in the third verse. I read the news today, oh boy, 4,000 holes in Blackburn, Lancashire, and though the holes were rather small, they had to count them all. Now they know how many holes it takes to fill the Albert Hall. I'd love to turn you on. Back in the 1960s, turn you on didn't mean what it means today. In our culture, that pretty much just refers entirely to sex. Back then, it mostly referred to drugs. Which of course is why that line was so controversial and why this song was banned by the BBC.
The moment I remember best, outside of him bringing the song, we got to a little bit that he didn't have, where we sort of said, I'd love to turn you on. And we looked at each other and think we know what we're doing here, don't we? We're actually saying for the first time ever, words like turn you on. And there was a little sort of look of recognition between us, do it, get it down.
And so there we see that Paul was a driving force in creating probably the main and most important line in the whole song of A Day in the Life. The one that made it somehow connect and fit perfectly as the climax of the whole album, in keeping with the theme. And we also have the line, now you know how many holes it takes to fill the Albert Hall. And I think this is a bit of classic John Lennon wordplay. We've got two meanings here. Holes could be arseholes, bums on seats. We know how many arseholes it takes to fill the Albert Hall, 4,000. But do you remember the theme of the second side of the record introduced by George? It's far too late when you pass away. Billy, the man from the motor trade, died in a car. This could mean, in the context of this narrative, there's a hole in the road with your name on it. Join the movement now, before it's too late. And of course, I'd love to turn you on, understood in its 60s sense, is them saying, we would love to welcome you into the club. We would love to be the ones who introduce you to this new lifestyle. Now, of course, like I said at the beginning, this is all hypothetical, but if this album is a story advocating LSD use as a way to escape the world and get into a new alternative way of life, imagine what would have happened if the Beatles had openly come out and said that in 1967. If that is the case, if that really is what the album's about, they had to bury it between layers and layers of vagueness and opaque meaning. And I wonder if there's some connection there between what do you see when you turn out the light? I can't tell you, but I know it's mine. Right at the beginning, Billy told us he has a secret he can't tell us. A Day in the Life finishes with the ultimate conclusion, a gigantic ringing chord that goes on and on. The stage fades slowly to black and the curtain descends. But then, when you think it's all over, the house lights don't go up, because there are two further strange sounds that finish out the album. After the chord, there is a 15 kilocycle frequency, a dog whistle, played for a short moment, and that sound is not audible to everyone. Not everyone can tune in to that frequency, literally. Dogs can, but only some human beings can pick up the sound that the Beatles were transmitting there. On an album as meticulously planned and executed as this, Was that included just for a laugh, just to irritate dogs? I think not somehow. It's actually not a very difficult code to crack. The message and story of this secret concept album is not being broadcast on a frequency that everyone can tune into. And look at the dictionary definition of dog whistle. A subtly aimed political message which is intended for and can only be understood by a particular demographic group. I mean, that's why it's there, isn't it? It's a dog whistle, both literally and figuratively. In an album that is just one massive double meaning, you've got that double meaning there. The message and meaning of this album is intended for those who get it, those who are tuned in to the right frequency. And then we hit the run-out groove of the album. This contains an endlessly looping few sections of gibberish that goes on forever. It's about 2 seconds of audio, and do you know how long they spent recording it, getting it right? 9 hours. 9 hours for a 2-second clip. What that loop said clearly was important, and I believe it's directly connected to the dog whistle. Most people think it says never could be any other way over and over, but I don't think it does say that. There's a definite SP in there. I think it says in a strange chopped up way, I never could speak any other way. And when you take that phrase with the dog whistle, it just makes perfect sense. This album is being broadcast on a special secret frequency that not everyone can access, and we never could have said what we wanted to say in any other way. I've no idea what you think about that. I am just kind of having fun with it, but I do think that that is probably pretty close to the mark. And perhaps the stuff we've been looking at today is part of the reason it was so massive, because it was on some subliminal level telling the story of the times. It was reflecting back to people in a kind of under the surface way exactly what was happening right then in youth culture. I think it resonated with people profoundly, sometimes in ways they couldn't quite define. Many concept albums that are secretly telling some message that speaks to people tend to be incredibly popular, and that's because it's speaking to the listener deep down in a way they can't quite articulate. They just know they want more, but because the message is never clearly spelled out, they find themselves just going back to the album again and again and again, just chasing after that hard to grasp feeling. But what do you think? There's loads of different ways to interpret an album like this, so let me know if you think I'm somewhere near the mark in the comments below. And my album is out soon, and this is a closed concept album, so if you reckon you can have a crack at decoding this, I'd love to hear what you think. If you're up for the challenge, get yourself a copy on vinyl ideally, and get in touch if you think you know what the story is. And as always, let me know in the comments if you've seen something in Sgt. Pepper's that I might have missed. And I'll see you next time.